Good evening.
Good evening.
It is good to see you. I agree with my father. The age of miracles apparently has not ceased. We do see Brother Weaver here with us tonight after major surgery yesterday. And we're very, very pleased to see him and his family. At least, I guess, did you leave your wife downstairs tonight?
Yeah.
I figured you might. You know, there's so many things I could say about what you have around your neck and your wife and the comments you made in the past. I'll just let that go.
I didn't know they used condoms on humans. That's okay. You'll get over when they're born.
Yeah. Okay. Oh. Okay. All right. We have a lot of ground to try to cover tonight, and I'm going to do my best to cover it if possible, but we're only going to deal with maybe a third of chapter 22. It's a very long chapter. And I'm going to try to delve into some questions tonight that I'm still, at the moment, trying to resolve in my own mind fully. I'm not going to, again, present anything in a dogmatic point of view, but I do want to throw some things out for your consideration. Maybe you have heard of or maybe thought about, but it certainly will hopefully bring some things to your attention that are worthy of consideration. So, verse 1 of chapter 22, now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover. And the chief priest and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them, and they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." So they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare?" He said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready." So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him, and he said to them, "With fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." He took the cup and gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." Then they began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. So let's just stop here, because there's plenty of material to try and unravel just in these few verses. I want to begin with a quick background study of the Passover and some thoughts about the Passover. I hope you're going to keep your Bibles handy, and you'll mark Luke 22, and you'll begin turning with me. In fact, let's just turn now to Exodus chapter 12. As you recall, this is the night that the death angel was to go throughout the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of man and beast was to die at the hands of the death angel. And the only means of escape was given to the people of Israel in the manner that we're going to be reading in just a moment. I want to say something that I had never considered before in my entire life. And I'll share this with you as we begin this study of chapter 12. And that is that this Passover that is instituted here is being instituted prior to and before the law of Moses. I'd never even considered that before. But just as circumcision was predating the law and was then later incorporated into the law, so the Passover predated the law and was later incorporated into the law, but it certainly predated it, and there may be some significant thoughts along that line as we continue in our study tonight. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire. Its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So this is the background to this feast, or this series of feasts, as we'll see in our study tonight, that is commencing in Luke 22. But this is the background to it. This is where it started. It was the precursor to Israel's leaving Egypt after finally being liberated. And this, of course, the passing of the death angel and the death of the firstborn was the very catalyst that allowed Israel to, in fact, leave and be emancipated from slavery. So it was indeed a very significant experience. Now, what's interesting is to see the use of blood, obviously, and God saying to Israel, when I see the blood, what? Hence the Passover. I will pass over you when I see the blood. And it really doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand the significance of that. Blood has always been associated with sacrifices from the foundation of the earth. Even to the present day, all acceptable sacrifices must have blood associated with them, including in the Christian age. And the Hebrew writer makes a very clear case about that all things are consecrated with the blood of Christ, in our case, which reminds me, when we come to the New Testament, we're told specifically, 1 Corinthians 5:7, for indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. So when we think of this, the Passover, the first thing we think of is Israel's emancipation from slavery. And that's, for all the centuries that Israel observed that feast, that's what they were commemorating. And yet when we come to the New Testament, we hear Paul saying, Christ is our Passover, letting us know that, yes, indeed, it was a memorial of their emancipation. There's no question about that. But there was also another meaning associated with it and signification, and that is the blood of Christ that would be shed in time to come. You remember when John the Baptist saw Jesus walking on the banks of the Jordan River. Behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world. And so he's described by his cousin literally as the Lamb of God. And so here we have a lamb or a goat, but the Jews were more inclined to take the lamb because a goat will fight with you, a lamb won't. You can just slay a lamb, it won't really give you much of a fuss. And so we go silently to his death, and that's, again, the picture that Isaiah gives us of Jesus. As a lamb going to the slaughter, and before its shearers, he didn't even open his mouth. He didn't put up a fuss, didn't argue, just went willingly along with what was happening. So again, this is the background to that, and this is, of course, the signification for us today. Christ is our Passover. So just keep that thought in mind, and let's return to Luke 22 very quickly. And I want you to remember that we read in the opening verses that the chief priests and the scribes, the leadership, convened a business meeting among themselves to discuss exclusively the question, how and when and under what circumstance are we going to kill Jesus? Now, you remember in John chapter 11, when Jesus had raised Lazarus, in the next chapter, it says that they came together and were plotting there to put him to death, lest the whole world should go, put both Lazarus and Jesus to death, lest the whole world should go after him and believe in him. And so they recognized that Jesus was performing, outrageous miracles. I mean, this just doesn't happen because someone can fake it or pretend. This is the real deal. And they knew that. And if we let this go on, then we're going to lose our standing. And so in order to put him down, that's what Pilate, remember, said. It was envy that had them deliver Jesus. So they just were envious of the fame that certainly would be his if they did not step in, they thought, and put an end to it. So here in the first few verses of chapter 22, it's kind of a summary of the last 6 days, at least, of Jesus' life. And you'll see why I'm saying that in a moment. You get the impression this all happening the same day, but those first opening verses of chapter 22 is just kind of an overview of that last week. And these are the events that were happening in that last week. And one of those events was they came together and they were plotting to kill Jesus. In fact, turn with me very quickly to Matthew 26. This will be instructive. And I'm hoping this will make sense in a minute. I'm just going to be honest with you. There's so much material that's exploding in my brain right now. I'm trying to put a governor on it and control it so that I can make some sense of something. So if I'm not careful, I may wind up not saying anything of value. I hope I can, but just stay with me and just try to stay awake. I mean, I was told by one of our deacons tonight, it better be a good class. And I said, well, why is that? Because I'm tired. I said, okay. I'm not going to say Ronnie's name, but I would not want to put him on the spot. But I totally understand that. If I were sitting in the class, I'd feel the same way. Matthew 26, came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings that he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days, and that's a marker, by the way. Just remember this. Okay, you know that after 2 days is the Passover and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Then, this is not a chronological deal here either, so don't get lost here. It's not as though now at that time, but the chief priests, the scribes, the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him, but they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. That's going to be something to remember in a moment too. And listen now, you got to pay attention to what he's saying. When Jesus, now this is that's one thought, that's kind of a summary statement, but we're starting again with another thought. When Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor. But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, why do you trouble the woman? For she had done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. Again, one of the things I've learned as I've been digging deeply, and we already knew this from Matthew's account especially, you cannot follow these paragraphs chronologically. You cannot say, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Some things, yes, but Matthew does a lot of back and forth. This is oh, by the way, this happened. Kind of like me in teaching a class. Oh, and I want to mention that too. And so Matthew's just pulling all these things out and telling us, but this is not a chronology. For example, verse 6. Verse 6 happened 6 days. That fragrant alabaster box was broken 6 days before what we're reading in Luke 22 took place. And yet, it said in verse 2 of this chapter, you know that after 2 days is the Passover. So, again, this is not chronologically arranged. I just want you to be aware of that when you read this. It's just these are the things that were happening in those last days leading up to that final act. Okay, Matthew 26, 1-16. Now, what I want to point out too is in this reading, we learned that there was a dispute among the disciples because of this fragrant oil that was worth a lot of money, and it was just poured out. And there was this thought among the disciples, as Matthew records it, they were indignant that this was just a great waste. Sounds like business meetings. I've attended a lot of business meetings. We got to be careful how we use the Lord's money. So here we are arguing about how this money was used, and that, et cetera, et cetera. So we know, and we're going to see this in a moment, that the leading voice in this indignant rebuke was Judas Iscariot. He's the one who's making this point. And it's also worth noting that this was the catalyst that allowed Satan to enter his heart and then allowed him to betray his Lord because they offered him money. That's what we learned in Luke 22. That's all we learned in Luke 22. They offered him money. Here we learn it was 30 pieces of silver, which
How much is that in today?
I don't know. I haven't gone and done somebody Google that. I knew you were going to ask me that question. I have no idea. It's not a lot of money. 30 pieces. I remember somebody said one day that was the wages of a slave, I think, of a day's wage or something. It wasn't much. It was a piddling amount. But again, that's what they offered him. That's what he took. So I just want you to hold that thought. And I want us to go back to Luke 22, and I want us to think about these opening verses, verse 3 of chapter 22, where Satan entered Judas. It, it's how much?
Between $91 and $400.
Somewhere between $91 and $400. So it's more than I thought. And that's not a lot. I mean, that ain't much to sell your master and Lord out for. But, I mean, especially if it's less than $100, that's not much. But, well, in today's dollars, it would probably be $45 with inflation. You'd be amazed at some of the comments that commentators, so-called Bible scholars, have to say about Satan entering Judas, pitying Judas. We feel sorry for Judas because Satan possessed him, so to speak, overtook him, overwhelmed him, and forced him to do what he did. I could not disagree any more vehemently with that assessment. That is not what's taking place here. And I guess we'll see in a moment. Well, I do want to ask the question, because when we think of Judas, we first of all ask, who was he? Who was Judas? What's that? He was an apostle. Well, who chose the apostles? Okay. So did Jesus predetermine this man to do what he did? Did he know he was going to do it? Okay, those are, again, different thoughts. But it's amazing how people get so bent out of shape trying to figure out how Satan did this. It's not complicated. It really isn't complicated. In fact, I want us to go now to John chapter 12. And, of course, the Gospel of John it's really rich, and it sheds a lot of light on much of what we'll be saying tonight. But in John chapter 12, let's just look at verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came. See, that's where I got that number a while ago. You wonder, where did I get that? Well, it's right here in John. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of now we know it was Mary. It wasn't just some woman, but it was Mary. And Mary and Martha have been brought up before by name. But she took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Well, she has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not always have." This is an interesting insight because, again, we learn that Matthew's account that we read in Matthew 26 is not stated in chronological order. So we see that that's confirmed. We also see that this pouring of the oil was 6 days before the events of Luke 22. And then again, we see that it was Mary who offered this fragrant oil, and that it was Judas himself. Now, the point I want to make about this is that when it comes to temptation, when it comes to dealing with temptation, we need to remember, as the apostle taught in Ephesians 6, that we are not wrestling, we're not fighting against flesh and blood. We're dealing with spiritual forces in high places, powerful forces. Now, when I say powerful, I want to say this about Satan. He knows you. Now, he's not all-knowing. He's not God. So he's unlike God. He doesn't know everything about you, but he knows enough about you to know what your weakness is. He knows what you're dealing with at the moment. Matthew 4. Jesus had fasted 40 days, and Satan came to him and said, "Hey, you're the Son of God. Command these stones be made bread." Why would he do that? Because he knew he'd been here 40 days. He was able to observe that, take note of that, and he's exploiting that, trying to take advantage of him in his weakened condition. He does you the same way. He'll deal with you in the same terms. I mean, if he's audacious enough to go to the very Son of God, and he knew who Jesus was. The demons knew who he was. Satan certainly knew who he was. So he came to Jesus, and this is audacious. You know, he's tempting him literally, personally, in his weakened condition. But there was another instance, please, Matthew 16, where Jesus had announced that he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to suffer at the hands of the Gentiles and be buried and raised the third day. And Peter said, "Lord, if that's the case, then don't go." You remember what Jesus said to Peter? Wow, that's strong. Why would he talk to Peter like that? Because he recognized this isn't just Peter saying this. Satan is speaking through Peter to get me to do what the very thing I need to do, but not do the very thing I need to do. He's tempting me. So he's literally putting up the strongest resistance. Get behind me, Satan. Can't deal with it. Don't talk to me like this. You ever think that Satan uses people in your life to tear you down, to tempt you, to distract you, to lead you astray? Of course. Who's behind that? Who's manipulating these events? And you say, well, if that's true, what defense do I have? I'm glad you asked. Read Ephesians 6, verse 10 through the end of the chapter. It's a powerful text. Be strong, what? In the Lord, and what? The power of his might. You will not succeed in fighting against Satan if you're doing it on your own terms, with your own strength. If you're relying on yourself, you will lose every single time. Amen. But if you put your trust and faith in God and in the armament and defense mechanisms that he provides us. The shield of faith, the sword of the, all of those. If you provide yourself with that, take the whole panoply of God we sing. Soldiers of Christ arise. And that's what we're saying. Put on all these defensive pieces because it's the only way you will withstand in the evil day. But Judas failed in the day of temptation. And why? Notice what happened 6 days before the night he came and kissed him in the garden. 6 days before that, what was he doing? He was in the house of Simon, and he's enjoying a meal with Lazarus. That's pretty cool. He's there at the house of Lazarus and the other people, and they're having a great time. And then Mary comes in. She's having a great time, and she does what women do. She wants to show her love to the Lord. So she breaks his fragrant oil, and she pours it on his feet and his head and everything else, and she's just so glad. And Judas is like, what a waste. And Jesus' response to that, you've always got the poor, but you don't always have me. Something about that. Because we know, and John tells us, he didn't express what he did because he truly cared for the poor. His weakness was that he carried the money bag. By the way, that was a position of trust. He wasn't just an apostle. He was given the money bag. The Lord put him in a position of trust. I mean, we think of Judas as a horrible man, and we should, but prior to this betrayal, he would not have been seen or viewed as this horrible individual that we know of. In fact, quite the opposite. And I'll say more about that in a moment as well. But again, I want you to think about how Satan is able to take even the strongest, the most trusted, and is able to exploit their weaknesses and destroy them with their own weaknesses. And that's what we're learning here, that Satan entered into his heart. How did he do that? Well, I think we've established how he did that. He took the occasion in the house of Simon, and he allowed that to just fester in his mind, and no doubt had others speaking to him and encouraging him. You don't need to follow this man anymore. This just isn't working out the way you thought it was. And besides, you can make some money if you can just tell the authorities how to get a hold of it. And so that's what he did. He sold his Lord out. It's really quite tragic. They gave him money. That's what Luke 22 says. That's all it says. They gave him money. I wonder sometimes, what am I going to sell the Lord out for? This is what, $90 maybe? $100? He's going to throw it all away? $30, what I always heard too, but I guess with inflation, maybe the numbers are higher now because it takes more to have the same amount. $30 was worth a lot more when you heard that than it is now. $1 was worth a lot more than it is now. But it wasn't much money. But the question that I have to ask, you have to ask, what am I willing to sell the Lord out for? They just gave him money. I mean, when you think about money and all the negative things associated with it, it's almost fitting, isn't it, that it was money that was the downfall of Judas and ultimately of betraying the Lord. Okay, now let's get to the question at hand. We have enough time, I think, to try and cover this. And I want you to notice how I'm phrasing this. It's by design. Jesus eats with the 12. Now, the question I want to raise, was it the Passover lamb that they were eating? And it was a Passover. Okay. Stay with me. That's true. But as one writer said, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were separate, and yet they were so intermingled that they were referred to interchangeably. We just saw that in our reading tonight. The gospel writers themselves use the terms interchangeably. The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Passover, one lapping over the other. By the way, the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted 7 days. It's a week-long celebration. There was preparation for it, and then there was a conclusion at the end. So it was a big deal. It wasn't just like a one-night thing. There was this eating of the lamb one night, but the Passover itself, in the mind of any Jew at that time, was this whole week-long celebration. So keep that thought in mind when you ask, and I want to ask you this question. I've often wondered this, and it kind of triggered this thought today. I got so obsessed. I haven't done anything today but try to figure this out. I mean, I've been going nuts over this. And if somebody could help shed light on this, please do. But here's the thing that got me to thinking. All of my life, I've heard Jesus sitting down with the 12 eating the Passover. Okay? Well, he's sitting down eating the Passover. Where is any mention of a lamb and bitter herbs in any of the Gospels? Not there. They don't mention it. Now, you say, well, maybe they didn't have to. I don't know. If Jesus is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, he's the fulfillment of all of that, you'd think at some point he would have said something about it, about the significance of that, and then transition from that. There's no eating of the lamb, it would appear, in this meal that we're hearing described in Luke 22. Now, it was associated with the Passover festivities, yes, and was therefore described in that term, but was it the actual eating of the lamb? Okay, while you're looking at me funny, I want you to think about what day of the week would this be? Many years ago, I heard Brother Winston Temple presenting a series of arguments that at the time I completely dismissed out of hand. I thought, Brother Temple, I love him to death. He was by far one of my favorite teachers. In fact, probably the most respected of all my teachers. But he spent a long time talking about Jesus dying on Thursday, being buried, and then resurrected on Sunday. I thought, everybody knows it was Friday. But I remember the arguments that he made, but at the time I was young and I just thought I knew everything. So I thought, well, this is kind of unorthodox. Nobody believes that. I mean, we know that he was crucified on Friday, but he made the case on Thursday. I thought, but you can't do that. And I'll show you why. And you're probably thinking the same thing, but I want to answer your questions. It's right here. We just have never really seen it. But again, was he eating the lamb? Was this the Passover feast that we just read in Exodus 12? Okay, well, let's take a moment to consider a few things. Now, when it comes to the first problem that I have, that I've always had, it's got to be Friday, because what was the next day? Sabbath. The Sabbath is coming. Well, what day is Sabbath? Saturday. Okay. Leviticus 23:23. The Lord, that's why I've always resisted this. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a what? A Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets. This is the Feast of Trumpets. A holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. You shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. Leviticus 20. In fact, I just picked this one out because it's to the point. The rest of them, all those feasts that are discussed in Luke 20 or Leviticus 23, all of those are the same thing. They were all Sabbath worship days. However, you'll notice that they were not on Saturday. In fact, let's see, what verse was that? No, let me go back to Leviticus. Leviticus 23. Let's look at something very quickly. Leviticus 23. I'm reading this from the New King James. If you have an English Standard Version, you have an advantage. But verse 3 of Leviticus 23. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. And it was. Every Saturday was a Sabbath day. But the 7th day was the 7th day. The Sabbath day was a holy convocation in which no work was to be done, but worship was offered to God. That's what a Sabbath was. But the Sabbath was observed every Saturday. That's true. Every 7th day there was a Sabbath, but there were many Sabbaths. If you go to this whole chapter, just read through chapter 23, you'll see what I'm saying. I won't read all that, we don't have time. But all of these feasts were described in the same way, and they were described as a Sabbath rest, regardless of what day of the week they came on. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, now couple that with what we read here in John 19. I remember Brother Temple made a big deal about this years ago. I didn't give it much stock, but I think he's exactly right. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies, whose bodies? Jesus and the malefactors that were crucified with him. What day was that? It was the preparation day. That the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. Wait a minute. Why this parenthetical statement? That they should remain on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. What Sabbath would that be? Well, if you read Leviticus 23, if you understand how Jews would look at it, on the 14th day of the month Nisan at the time of Jesus, that would be the Passover day. That would be that high Sabbath. And so before the Sabbath gets here, get them off the cross. Now, why would Jesus be eating the Sabbath lamb if it hadn't occurred yet? Now, chapter 19, verse 31, because it was a preparation day. I'm not willing to argue with John. He said it was a preparation day. And what did we learn about Peter and John already? Well, we're going to learn this in a minute too. They were making preparation. Literally, that's what they were doing. And it was called preparation day, leading up to the day after, which would be Passover. Okay, hold that thought. Mark 14, verse 1 and 2, after 2 days, it's just a marker in time. After 2 days, it was the Passover and the feast of, I can't read with your glass, and the feast of unleavened bread. Again, notice Passover and feast of unleavened bread. They just go hand in hand. Again, Leviticus 23 will help explain that. And the chief priest and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. Okay, now look at verse 12 of the same chapter. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover? These are markers in time. Okay, so we have 2 days. Now we have the first day of that feast that begins. So what day of the week would this be? This would be Wednesday evening. It would be the same day of the week we're presently meeting. And that meal would be about now. It would come after sundown on that Wednesday. Of course, in the spring of the year, the sun goes down a little sooner, I think, than it does now. It's about the same as it is right now, but I think a little sooner. Now look at this in John 13. This is interesting. This is what throws a lot of people for loops. Now, listen to how John says this. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, and supper being ended. What supper? The supper we're reading about in Luke 22. The supper that's described in John 13. What supper was that? It couldn't have been, because he said before the feast of the Passover. He clearly said that. Supper being ended. What supper? The supper we're now talking about. Luke 22. Supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So again, there's a marker in time. So this is the day before the Passover. They're getting together the evening before the Passover. But now, the 14th day, according to the Jewish reckoning, would be after sunset that night, right? So everything that happened, the meal that we're now talking about, the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, and death of Jesus all happened on the day of Passover, technically. You understand what I'm saying? Because if you're a Jew, that's how you reckon time. And the evening and the morning were that's how they reckon time. Okay. Now, look at this passage. This is interesting. Alfred Edersheim does phenomenal work, or did, on Jewish customs, and he explains some things that really make a lot of sense. And I'll say that, let's read the text, that leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, Lord, who is it? This after Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. And this is John, who's leaning on Jesus' breast. Now, before we continue reading, Edersheim would talk about as they reclined. And that's what Mark's gospel said. They were reclining at the table. They weren't standing. By the way, in Exodus 12, we just read it, they were standing when they ate the Passover. They were not reclining. They stood. But here they're reclining at the table. And according to Edersheim, the custom was to recline on your left side. And the person to your left had the chief seat. The person right behind you, if you were the presider, the person behind you on your right side had the second chief seat. Now, on the left side of Jesus was Judas Iscariot, the chief seat at that table. So, again, I want you to keep this in mind. And now John leans over and speaks to Jesus after putting his head on his breast. And Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot. He was right there. He just dipped it and handed it to Judas. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas, and the son of Simon. Now, after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. And Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." But no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought, now listen to this, because Judas had the money box, that Judas had said to him, had said to him, "Buy those things we need for the feast." But they just ate it. Or are they assuming something? What are they assuming? Well, maybe they're going to eat some more through the course of the week. Maybe that's what some are suggesting. He calls it the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. But having received the piece of bread, he went out immediately, and it was night. John 13:25-30. My betrayer is with me. Now, I want to say this to kind of conclude before our time runs out, just putting all this together. I believe firmly, and the more I've looked at this, and I mean, you don't have to believe what I'm saying. This is purely something for a Bible class like this. Something to think about. You can consider it, you can reject it, or whatever. But I want you to consider that Wednesday night, just like we are now, we're reading about this meal. This was not the eating of the lamb, but it was associated with the Passover celebration. It took a week to celebrate this thing. So this is the first night, and they're here celebrating it. Jesus was then arrested later that night. Okay, and then he was carried, and all through the night was sent through mock trials. The next day was put to death. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, they nailed him to the cross. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he gave up the ghost. Now, what's fascinating is that being the case, if my chronology is correct, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was the precise time in the day of this Passover when the priest would slay the Passover lamb. And so Jesus is literally dying in conjunction with the Passover lambs. I never thought about that before, but that makes perfect sense. And so Paul would say he is our Passover. And he's dying the very day they're offering them. So that night, by the way, here's another thought. The chief priest and the elders came with the soldiers to arrest Jesus in the garden. If this was the Passover night, that would not have taken place. In fact, those same men would not go into the judgment hall with Pilate the next morning because they didn't want to be defiled and therefore not be able to take the Passover and be defiled for the Passover the next morning. They wouldn't have come into the garden the night the Passover was being observed. They were Pharisees. They weren't going to do that. They wouldn't violate that much, of their tradition. They were evil men, yes, but they were strict when it came to observing these particulars of the law. So that does not lend itself to be the night of the Passover, them coming to arrest him at that time of the night when they should have been eating the Passover. So that's just one thought. Then again, the next night, Jesus was taken down from the cross, and before 6 p.m., before the evening and the setting of the sun, Joseph of Arimathea had him basically wrapped and put into his own tomb, and then everyone went to their abodes and they ate the Passover. And so Jesus was in the grave. That's my understanding. So 3 days, 3 nights, Jesus was in the heart of the earth just as he said he would. Now, I mentioned Psalm 41 verse 9 because the psalm writer predicted, even though this was a psalm of David and he was talking about being betrayed by his own close personal friend, this text was cited and referenced in connection with Jesus and connection with Judas and Jesus. And so Jesus, of course, was the one who was betrayed by one who ate bread with me. Someone close to him, someone in the chief seat. By the way, next week, if we have time, we get there. Next week, a dispute breaks out while they're having this meal. Who's the greatest among us? Well, I was asking my father earlier today, who do you think started that argument? Was it Judas? Because he's taken the chief seat. And my dad said, probably Peter. And the more I think about it, I'm thinking, that was Peter, because Peter would have been directly across, according to Edersheim. He would have been at the last place, across directly from Jesus, John, and Judas. And he looks, of course, at John, remember, across the table. He said, what did he say? Who did he point to? So, Peter wanting to know, but who's more likely to say, who do you think you are sitting there? And he already knew about that heated exchange between Jesus and Judas at the house of Simon just days before this. And so he's thinking, what are you doing sitting there in the chief seat? And so it probably, I'm just guessing, we don't know, maybe Peter started that argument. Who do you think you are sitting there? So it's really unseemly that these men are having this discussion at all. Whoever started it, and for whatever reason, they shouldn't be talking. This is a solemn occasion. They didn't realize at the time just how solemn, but it is a very solemn occasion. And here they are arguing about who's the greatest. And it probably because Judas was in the chief seat at the table. I never thought about that either. That's kind of creepy. Yes.
Some years ago, I wrote a tract from John 13, which I took the position that one of the thieves said, this is not the Passover feast.
Yes.
As so often. So I'd like to find that. We reprint that from me. I'd like to remember what I said. I forgot what I said.
Can't remember the argument, can you?
Here in John 13, it triggered an incident that happened some years ago. You might find some humor about it. But someone knocked on my door in my office at East Point. A brother came in that I knew quite well. He said, Brother Gray, just learned something today. It surprised me. Okay, what was it? I found out that Judas Iscariot was the Apostle Peter's son. I said, well, that is interesting. Where'd you find that out? He said, I found that in the Bible. I said, I don't think you found that in the Bible. And he said, well, you're a preacher. You believe it. If I read it in the Bible, of course, I would, but I don't think you'll read it in the Bible. Who read this verse? Judas Iscariot, Simon's son. You see there? I tried to do, brother, that there's several John, several Jesuses, and
Several Simons.
Several Simons in the Bible, not just one Simon. And he got so angry when he saying that, he slammed the door and left.
I'm not the only one that has that effect on people. Okay. Yeah, I didn't fall far from the tree, huh? Yes?
I just want to clarify what you're saying. So you're saying they were eating the supper on Wednesday.
This supper, yeah.
And he was arrested on Wednesday.
Well, it was, but it was Thursday for them because after sunset, it would be Thursday.
But then Thursday morning would have been when he
Still
was
been
died.
that 14th day. Yeah.
Okay, so then Thursday afternoon's when he died. I mean,
Yeah.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, yeah.
Okay. I just,
The 14th, that would be the day of Passover, yeah.
okay, so then but you were saying they ate the Passover on Friday?
Yes, well, no,
Thursday
Thursday
night.
night, but it would be Friday to us, but it was Thursday night to the Jews. Thursday night to us, but Friday to them, yeah, because they were Jews. They counted beginning evening to morning. Yeah.
It had to be before 5 happened. It had to be before 5 because the Bible says that the skies turn black, which means what?
Yeah, it was dark.
It was dark.
Yeah.
It was light before that.
But I think the light came back on before the day was over, didn't it? It only was for 3 hours, I think, there was darkness. From 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, it was dark. Anyway, it's something to think about. And to me, what I get from this that really stood out that I never thought about before is the seating arrangement at the table and where Judas was and where John was and where Peter would have been. By the way, when Jesus got up to wash their feet, which that would put this as the same feast, got up to wash their feet, he would have started with Peter because he was at the end of the table. His leg would have been out behind him like the rest of them who were reclining. He would have started with Peter and gone around, and that's where you get that exchange between Peter and Jesus. Where did I get it? From the Gospels here, I just share with you.
We learned that.
Are you talking about the reclining at the table? I got that from Mark. But Alfred Edersheim gave insight into how these seats were arranged. Like the chief seat, I didn't know that, but Edersheim, the one who gave me the information about the chief seat, would be the one directly on the left side of the one. There was one presiding at these feasts. And for those feasts to be legitimate, there had to be at least 10 people present. Well, in this case, there were 12, and Jesus was the one presiding at it. So the one sitting directly or lying or reclining next to him on his left, that would be the chief seat, and the one on the right side would be, on his back side rather, would be the second seat. But you can understand, Jesus is leaning this way, and he's leaning toward Judas. That's fascinating, because all these thoughts we have about Judas, but leading up to this night, who was he? Well, he was very trusted, was in the inner circle. He was an apostle.
But he was a thief, huh?
Yeah, he was a thief too, yeah.
He took money that was in the box and bag.
He was a friend, yeah. 680. Who are you? 680. Don't forget this Saturday at 12 o'clock at the American Pie Pizzeria in Carrollton. We have our monthly men's fellowship. I'd love all the men to be there. That's at the American Pie Pizzeria in Carrollton at 12 o'clock.
They got good pizza.
They got okay pizza, yeah.
But you can buy a really, really big pizza.
Oh, yeah.
That will feed about 10 people, man.
Okay, you gonna buy mine?
Huh?
You gonna buy mine?
Well, I'll have some.
I'll eat from yours. But just don't dip it in anything. Okay. Fall gathering, the Little Lights and youth group will have a chili and soup supper at the home of the Cunninghams this Sunday, starting at 4 o'clock. Please plan to bring soup, dessert, and pumpkins to carve. S'more supplies will be provided. Please see Jonathan or Tessa for any questions. Who's that? Area-wide Widowhood Fellowship, the next one, October the 25th, 11:30. Again, this is a lunchtime for the winter months. There are flyers on the table in the foyer for inviting other widows and widowers, if you know of any, and we can bring them and get them involved in this good work. Sing with Your Heart at the end of this month, the 29th and 30th, with Cheryl Wayne. We have Finger Food Fellowship at 5 o'clock planned, so we need to be preparing to get food and to be here. This is going to be a good time. We're going to really enjoy that weekend. It will be starting at 5 o'clock Saturday evening. We'll be out here by 8 o'clock, I'm sure, back Sunday morning at the regular times. But I'm looking forward to this singing weekend. So please be here and bring somebody with you. And let as many know as you can about it. Trunk or Treat will be the 30th, the day after, or rather that Sunday, at 5 o'clock. We'll have a cookout and a fire pit just like last year. Make plans to decorate your vehicle and make this a fun and safe experience for our young people. I was going to mention that Michael Weaver had surgery yesterday and recovering from it, but apparently he's here.
That's great. That's awesome.
I won't tell you what Stacy would say about that, but other than hard-headed, we're glad that you are, and that it is really good to have you with us tonight, because it's really a big surgery you went through, and we're really pleased that it went well. Good. And I'm being nice. This is the only time you're going to see that, so don't. Don't get used to it. Okay. Charlotte Borden, of course, Tammy Howard's mother. We want to continue to remember her as she declines with stage 4 cancer. David Bean, who also is fighting cancer. Thankful he was able to be here Sunday, but he's still struggling with that every week as he goes through his treatments. Mildred Logan is now in Kennestone Hospital. They haven't yet done the procedure, last I heard, but they're still waiting to see if they're going to be able to do anything to help her open her esophagus so she can eat again. Sorry to hear that Brother Tom McAvoy fell. Was it yesterday? And do what? No, I'm talking to her. Last night. And did he have his ribs examined, or did he just bruised himself really bad? Oh. Well, I hope they're not broken. If they are not, hopefully he'll heal soon. We're sorry to hear that he fell, and we hope that he's recovering soon. Any other announcements we need to make before we sing our song of invitation? We were studying tonight about the Passover, and Jesus, of course, being our Passover, and based on Exodus 12, the concept, of course, is when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And for our circumstance today, the blood of Christ is applied to our spiritual account when we obey the terms of the gospel that he gave. It's his gospel. It's his terms. And they're very explicit. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. So only adult believers who are capable of hearing and understanding what Jesus did, who he is, and what he means to us, only those individuals can be really, truly candidates for immersion in water for the remission of our sins. If this is your need tonight, or if we can help you in some other way, please don't hesitate to make your need known while together we stand as we sing.
Oh, thou